Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have pleasure activist and cultural sexologist, Dr. Carol Queen. Join us for a conversation about embracing the diverse world of sexuality and relationships. Together, we talk about how the values of anarchism intersect with our pleasure, pop sex positivity versus deep sex positivity, and how we need to work both within and against the systems. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to another episode of Modern Anarchy podcast. I am so delighted to have you here and for you to be joining this large community of pleasure activists, including our guest today, Dr. Carol Queen. She has so much wisdom from working within this space and seeing the ways that the movement for pleasure has shaped over the years, and I am delighted to be sharing this episode with you, dear listener. And, at one point, we were talking a little bit about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychology and Psychiatry. And I know I've talked about this book, the book, right, many times. You talked about it in last week's episode as well. And it's a running conversation on this podcast, but particularly in this conversation, it's very important, right? Because together, Dr. Carol Queen and I talk about the ways that there are guardians of the culture, people with power, doctors, teachers, psychologists, who get to define what is okay and what is not, right? Guardians of the culture. And when we look back in the history of the DSM, where we get to decide who is sick, quote unquote, who gets pathologized and who doesn't, homosexuality was in there until 1973, right? So within the field of psychology, homosexuality was a pathological diagnosis, right? So I think it's important to ask some questions about that book and the power that gets invested in the people who get to decide who is quote unquote sick and pathologized and who is healthy in these systems, right? And the DSM, until 2010, y'all, this has only been 13 years, 2010 had BDSM as a pathologized diagnosis. Okay, well, let's talk about that, right? When we had the episode with Dr. Sheff, we talked about how, research shows that 70% of people have BDSM fantasies. So 70% of our population could get pathologized with that one diagnosis up till 2010. So I just wonder if maybe we should be asking some questions about that book. It's wild when you really think about the power and the ways that, these systems get to decide reality, right? Seeing how kink was in there, seeing how homosexuality was in there. We have to critique the field of psychology. Guardians of the culture, who gets to decide what is health and what is pathology? With my background in sex and relationships and psychedelics, one of the pieces that really stuck out to me is the way that the field looks at, again, anything that's not quote unquote normal, right? So something like non-monogamy. I'm not going to name any names here because I don't think that helps us move towards the revolution. But in one of my classes, there is this prominent professor who is really well known within the relationship and marriage counseling space and works particularly with a very specific, well-known, theory within that space. And she had been talking about the theory, and it was all very couple-centric, very couples-focused. And I asked in class, I raised my hand, I was like, so, doctor, blah, blah, blah. This is all very couples focused. I'd be curious what it would look like if we could apply these models to non-monogamous couples. And she responded with, "Yeah, I'm sure we could, but here's the thing. Every time that I've seen a non-monogamous couple, it's always one couple that wants it and the other that doesn't, and it just really never works out." That was a clinician, a prominent clinician within the field of relationships and love and marriage, and she shared that to a whole class of students that non-monogamy usually never works out. Oof, in that moment, I didn't even know how to respond. My skin started to boil, and I took a deep breath and I said, that's actually not what I've seen in the community. I didn't name that. Obviously, that's definitely not what I'm doing. I'm loving my life with my multiple partners, but I said, that's not what I've seen within the community. I've actually seen many people that enjoy non-monogamy on both sides, and it's been interesting to process that with other professors and be reminded that that's a reflection of her positionality, right? All she sees is that, she lives in a monogamous worldview where that's all of her friends. And then all she sees of non-monogamy is in her therapist office. And so she makes the subsequent confirmation biased and, faulty assessment that then non-monogamy never actually works, etc., etc. And she is a guardian of the culture. She controlled what the message was around non-monogamy in that classroom with her clients and as a leader within this space. And so, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do here. If you are listening to this podcast and joining the psychology community, we need you. Let me tell you, we need you. And if you are sending this podcast to a friend via text, if you are having conversations about this podcast to all of my Patreon supporters out there, thank you. We are moving the needle slowly through one conversation at a time. And I just feel so grateful. I was, almost brought to tears this morning when I was thinking about recording this intro and this episode that I get to talk to people like Dr. Carol Queen, people who have been in this movement for way longer than I have, who can reflect on things that I don't even see, and to understand that I am a part of a long lineage of pleasure activists, just as much as she is. And you too, dear listener, you're here. You're a part of this movement. You are a part of the pleasure activists that are changing the world. And we have so much to do together in this space, so much. And hopefully we can also celebrate the ways that we have changed over the centuries, right? Homosexuality is no longer a diagnosis, and there is so much to celebrate with that and so much more to go at the same time. But just know that you are not alone in this movement. I am with you. Carol is with you. You are a part of a global movement here in this space. Together, we'll work towards making more space for our authentic pleasure and our authentic expression. And I believe in us, and we will keep taking steps towards that reality. All right, dear listener, I am sending you so much love. Continue to take care of yourself, love your community, reach out, and keep following your pleasure. Let's tune in to today's episode. So then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
I'm Carol Queen. I have a Ph.D. in sexology. I identify as a pleasure activist and a cultural sexologist, which is different from I have a white coat on and I'm going to examine your penis now, although that can be fun on weekends. I've written a bunch of books, edited some books, and contributed to a bunch more books and documentaries and this and that and the other thing. I like to talk about sex-related issues in pretty much all the contexts, but I am really most in love with thinking about this question of deep sex positivity and of diversity in general. So that filters in, I feel, to everything that I do and all the work that I do. And besides me and those things, I am the staff sexologist, company historian, and curator of the Antique Vibrator Museum at Good Vibrations. Ooh. If anybody can beat that job title, I dare you all to do it, because it is a Fine job title, isn't it? And
Yeah.
my partner and I, 20 plus years ago, co-founded the Center for Sex and Culture, the Center for Sex and Culture in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So busy.
And passionate. I can feel it in your energy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, those of us who came to the planet to get something done, we can't not, right?
I
We don't
know.
always know what it is at first, but we can't not do something, try to help, try to throw ourselves into it. So
Sure,
my guess is
sure.
that you've got some of that in you as well, and many, or if not all of your listeners do too.
Yeah, that inner like fire for something more, right? Which frequently gets us in trouble. But man, I think that's part of the process. Well, I'm excited to have you in the space and to chat with you. I like to ask guests too, like, is there something you're passionate about in terms of starting? I know you mentioned deep positive sexuality, so we could,
Deep sex positivity is
yeah.
what I'm talking about now. Yeah, I mean, I've been
Okay.
talking about sex positivity since the jump, but
Yeah.
many people use that term now, which is wonderful. It was it was an underground notion at one time, and it's
Mhm.
not so much anymore. Although, in my opinion, a lot of people miss the depth, which is why I added the
Mm.
word deep to it.
Yeah.
It's not our relationship to sex, although yay, sex. I mean, who could argue that feeling positive about sex is grand, but that's not all of what we're talking about when we talk about sex
Mm.
positivity. And so I like to unpack that. And these days, of course, if we didn't get into the question of sex negativity in the world in which we live, that would be a little surprising, wouldn't it? So I've been
Mhm.
thinking and talking about that quite a bit too, because a little hard to ignore and
Totally.
extremely important to
Yeah.
fight.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited for this conversation. Start unpacking it, and I want to hear all about it.
Well, shall I start by telling you where I first heard the term sex positive? Does that sound like a good place to
Sure.
start at the very beginning? The various place to start, as they say,
Yeah.
which is not, of course, the very beginning, because I didn't show up at the table when it got,
Sure.
determined. This is a phrase we will like to use. I mean, I wasn't there yet, but I came in relatively soon after that happened, because as far as I can research, this got developed and started to be talked about at my alma mater, the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco. And I showed up there in 1987. I showed up there in 1987 specifically because I wanted to do some kind of sex-related work that would make a difference in the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
That was the door that I chose to enter. I'd already been doing some AIDS work, but I felt like there was more to do. And the part that really grabbed me was being able to talk about safer sex and sexual risk and all that stuff
Sure.
in that context. And of course, HIV/AIDS still exists, but in those days, many communities were on fire,
Right.
not in a good way. And so I had to
Yeah.
something. So this is what I fell into doing in a way. I mean, I chose to do it, but I had only just realized that there was such a thing as sexology. So not surprisingly, once I embraced that, I got to the Institute with very interesting, quirkiest school in the universe, possibly, but a very interesting crowd of people, very interesting people
Yeah.
who had developed it, very interesting thinkers, and I fit right in those ways. I hope I can safely say. And when I heard the term sex positive there, I'd never heard it before. I had
Mm.
been a queer activist for not quite 15 years. At that point, I co-founded, I think, the third queer youth group in the country
Oh,
in the
wow.
early mid 70s, but who knows? I mean, there might have been dozens of them that I never ever heard about, but that was the third that I knew of and have heard of.
Yeah.
And so I had been out there in the trenches of talking
Mm.
to college health students and things like that
Sure. Yeah.
about queer sex and whatever,
Yeah.
and having some interesting adventures and
Uh-huh.
political organizing or activism or this or that. but I had never heard this phrase. And when I heard this phrase, it immediately made my brain light up. And I know why it made my brain light up. One, it wasn't that common to hear people talk really positively about sex at that time. I'm obviously in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. People were saying a lot of negative things and frightened things, right, about sex.
Mm-hmm.
And many people then, as now, just talked about sex in really limited and sort of siloized ways. And that was not actually how I experienced my own sexuality and my sexual adventures.
Yeah.
This seemed to broaden that. It also made me think immediately, of course, of the phrase sex negative, sex positive, sex negative. And then I thought about the word homophobia. And biphobia, transphobia, all the phobias, and realized that that the work that I was doing around those issues was very much related to this larger concept. And that was cool because I was not a strictly simple queer person. I was bisexual, bi-curious bisexual, lesbian identified, but lesbi. I mean, pansexual, I suppose, is what you could say that I was, but it wasn't easy to step across those boundaries as often as I did it. It was like I was skipping rope in a schoolyard with the sexual identity boundaries. I was just bouncing around as the rope spun around me.
Yeah.
And some people thought that was cool, and many people thought that was kind of bogus. So I felt personally supported by this notion, but I also felt really affirmed in having been the kind of activist that I've been so far. So that was my aha to it, right? And so I just turned 66. So the likelihood is really good that when you heard the term sex positive, the likelihood is really good that it was in the context of describing sex positive community, right? The people who come to sex inflected communities with Joy and Glee, I'm going to stop putting words in your mouth in 1 second and ask you what it was for you, because I'm very interested to know. But this idea is what it sort of morphed into as it got out of the corral of academics and sort of specialist-ologist type thinkers. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about this notion. People need to feel positive about sex, and when they hear this phrase, they're like, "Oh, that's what that is." Right? What was your path to that? Did you remember first hearing about it?
My God, Carol. I mean,
It's been in the water, right? Lately. So
Right. I mean, I grew up very Christian.
Okay.
Which meant I was not able to be queer, which meant I did not have a positive relationship to sexuality.
Maybe a little slut shaming, if anybody,
Dear God. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't masturbate. I couldn't even, like the whole thing. And so the first time I heard sex positive, I think was even like to be quite honest, like in my doctoral training, when I started like getting really like starting this podcast and getting really passionate about all of these things. And my mentor was like, here's a way that you can use this sex positive as what you're passionate about, so that I don't scare too many internship sites. Here's the word to use so you don't scare them with your queer, kinky, non-monogamous identity. Use sex positive. I was like, okay. So that's kind of how I know the term, is like as like a catch-all to speak to something in a way that's maybe professional to the larger psychology community. Which is super interesting and great. And it also, this is interesting. I haven't quite heard your narrative yet, which is I love. I mean, the raised Christian, no, my school didn't teach me about this. Yeah, that narrative is very common. But yes. But this reminds me of the overarching way that we began to use the term queer. Depending on who you ask, some 25, 30 years ago, the term queer really came into the LGBT, et cetera, a wonderful alphabet soup lingo, so that those people who didn't feel like I talked about before, like I was skipping around and jumping boundaries, and I didn't have just one orientation, kind of ever. And it kind of overarches in the same way that queer does for the
it's really not very binary when we talk about this set of initials. So let's just kind of make sure that we give this umbrella notion that helps us think about, well, it doesn't just help us think about sexuality. I mean, one of the things that I'm getting from your story is that it helps us identify in a particular kind of way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or communicate with others about how you're identifying and this and that.
Yep, exactly. Yep. In a way that could be digestible rather than like putting out your identities a little bit.
Yeah, and it's extremely useful in a way. And thinking in terms of people identifying as sex positive or as part of sex positive community, as your advisor or whoever was trying to communicate with, clearly successfully communicated with you, there's a lot of different ways underneath that umbrella that people could express their sexuality and live it, and or even just sort of sit there alone in the corner being in it, whatever
Yeah.
it is. And sex positive can cover basically any of that's consent based, any of it, anything, including, and I have this fight all the time with sex positive people, big old queerdos, etc. Not as much anymore, but also asexuals, people who have never had any sex at all, serious virgins, 40 years old and otherwise, and also virgin, what a bogus term, but anyway.
Right.
My point, people who've not had any sex with anybody else.
Yeah.
And people who've had terrible sex histories that honestly they don't want to have anymore because it was so bad so far. Those people can still be sex positive. We can still hold all of those folks within this embrace of sex positivity, because it does not mean I love sex, I have all the sex. It doesn't mean I'm open and poly, although it can mean that. It doesn't mean I'm queer, although it certainly can mean that. I mean, it doesn't mean any one thing aside from this radical, not judgmental space about the variety of sexual possibility, sex and gender possibility, I might add, because those things are a complex, like living math problem. They're not opposites. They're not the same thing. It's
Intertwined.
cool. They're beautiful fractal things. And those notions, I think those are really important. It's important to understand that people have drifted to sex positivity or really felt that was the space that was expected that they identify around if they were a particular variety of sexual person, all the queerdos, all the frisky people, all of this, all of that. But, the monogamous cisheads have to understand that they too are embraced in this bigger embrace. Not all of them want to be, in that particular cuddle pile. I understand that, but I'm sorry, folks. Conceptually, you are there.
Yeah. How so? Say more.
Well, unless somebody's sex, desires, fantasies, explorations, behavior, preference, et cetera, is bound up in non-consent. And there are ways for that to be true where you could get out of it because the non-consent is not the point. Then there are other people for whom it seems that the non-consent is the point. But even the ones for whom the non-consent is not the point can be given a space, introduced to a space where we learn consent-based behavior and communication. And for all of us, hardly anybody certainly of my generation, maybe even of yours, really sort of was brought up into that specifically. We were brought up into, there are lots of things you don't do, but that's not the reason why exactly. It's because it's bad to do them. Somebody said it was bad to do them, and we're just carrying down the knowledge from Moses came down from the mountaintop and he had some tablets, and written on them was "Thou shalt not," right?
Yeah.
And for whatever other religious background and whatever was written on those tablets, there are a lot of "thou shalt nots" out there for a lot of reasons. And sex positivity is not really there for that, except thou shalt not behave in a non-consensual way with other people. Why? Because if we're talking within an overarching space of anarchism, because it's it's like the least pro-social
Right.
way that you can be in the world. You're doing top-down fuckery of whatever kind
Yeah.
it is, including just, and this is where I really got fired up about I've got to talk more about the deep stuff, because I started going and talking at, sex conferences and psych and social conferences and this and that, talking about sex positivity. And I would get a little pushback, and the pushback would basically be, well, yeah, but I don't really like that phrase because somebody used it to bully me. Like, what do you mean? Tell me what happened to you. Well, if you were really sex positive, you'd open up our relationship. If you were really sex
Oh.
positive, you'd let me fuck you in the ass. If you were really sex
Oh.
positive, you'd let me tie you up. If you were really, if you were really a cool kid, it's this
Yeah.
manipulative nonsense
Oof.
engaged in by some people who appear to really identify
Yeah.
as sex positive, who didn't ever get the class about, yeah, you don't behave in a non-consensual fashion, and that's not consent-based behavior and
Right.
communication. It's really
Right.
not.
No.
And it
Manipulation?
also,
No.
this idea that you could use, any identity or orientation or political notion that many of us hold dear to shove another person around. Let's not be that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all of the non-monogamous folks that try and convince monogamous folks to come to that side through like, I'll show you the way, I'll show you the way. And I guess I've been a part of that in the past, trying to get partners on this journey with me that didn't want to go on that journey, and the learning process that you go through of that, of like, that's not really an ethical way to do this, all right? To like try and convince people to go down different paths, or to, like you were saying, even more maybe like malicious ways of using, ideologies and values against another person. If you're sex positive, you would do this, right? And I think a really spicy one too to think about is that, like, obviously consensual non-consent is really fun and hot, but I say that in my psychology classroom, and then all of the psychologists in training look at me and are like, what, and I'm like, yeah, you can do that consensually, my
That's a double
friends.
negative. We can't go there. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that the whole field of sexuality related communication, especially like this academically or professionally contextualized stuff, this is really interesting to me, because this is how these sort of incremental changes move into the way that our professionals think and treat us. And now, of course, in the world of psychology, there are plenty of people who have stepped across those lines of things that used to just be in the DSM, to so that
Oh
the
yeah.
shrinks could bill insurance, and tell people that they were being problematic in the way that they express desire and eroticism. And that's
Totally.
problematic in and of itself in its ways. But as we started to wrestle with the DSM, and any podcast listeners who are not in a psych program might not know that DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yep.
What a fun book it is. And queer and kinkster and etc. people have really come to the table to negotiate and confer about this book, and say, all right, listen, of course, all the therapists want to be able to bill the insurance companies. It's not a bad thing if we're going to be, if we're going to live our lives and, feed our families. But there's also this problem of assuming that anything that's different from whatever we might think of as normative in any given community or at any given historical moment is wrong to do
Yeah.
or to want. And all you have to do is dig a little bit into the history of not quite modern into modern sexuality, and you see how many things used to be illegal or completely, it's not done even when it was being done. And now there is more space. There's pushback, such pushback now, but
Oh
that's
yeah.
because there's been a pretty enormous amount of movement. So the whole discussion about the DSM and pathologizing things allows us to say, there are people who do this without consent, and there are people who do it with consent and with mindfulness. And you cannot conflate those two things. You're not serving the populace if you're going to conflate those things. Those are things you don't want to conflate at all. You want to make sure people understand what consent looks like. You want to honor it. You want to teach it.
Yeah.
You want to support it as being, sort of the bright line. And if you're going to cross it, have really thoughtful conversations first with the people and get everybody's enthusiastic know-how and buy-in, right? And I'm not surprised to hear that in some classes full of, psychologists and therapists to be and stuff, that sounds a little janky, but you got to dig deeper and see why communities have developed, without the BDSM community, the differences in how things used to be thought about. My first book was Exhibitionism for the Shy in the DSM. I'm actually answering a question tomorrow to a journalist who's like, can exhibitionism ever be consensual? I'm like, would you read my book? You didn't even do a literature search, did you? It's right there. It's even still in print.
Jesus.
Hey. But somebody jumps out from behind a tree in the park and starts jerking off at you non-consensually. They call it exhibitionism. You could get sent to jail. And we have to be able to talk about the role that consent plays in empowering everybody who learns about it and uses it to understand that they might be not surrounded by people who want to do the same things as you, but empowered to find out who those people are who do want to play that way. Just like your anecdote about maybe pushing people that more than now you think you should have. I mean, that's steps on that path, right? Partly because nobody has to come in and hand you a pamphlet that says, hey, have you heard about consent? For you to have tried that a few times with a couple, 3 partners and go, why isn't this working? Why isn't this, it's so awesome to be this way. It's so awesome to live your life this way. Why are they so resistant? They were raised Christian too, or they were, and then understanding that it's really okay for people to want to be monogamous.
Yes.
That's just a thing. It's fine to want to be.
Yes.
And as the polyamory mothers of the 1980s used to say, I think I heard this from Deborah Anapol, the late Deborah Anapol. She said, it's common for people to want monogamous relationships. It's pretty common for people not to want monogamous relationships. It's the mixed marriages that get in trouble. Want different things, right?
Totally. And it's so hard when society has really like clamped down on you and always attacks you. So you want to like share that light with everybody. But you become so radicalized in it that you forget that like other people are constructing their own life that brings them joy. And your path is not going to be the same as other people. So like you're saying, when maybe a more vanilla therapist goes to pathologize the, kinky client, like the non-monogamous person who looks at the monogamous person and pathologizes them, like is doing that same level of like imposing your reality on another person.
And both sex positivity and anarchism want us to be able to live in community.
Yeah. And
community that's diverse. I mean, it's a little easier to live in undiverse communities in various ways, and that could be not just very, very various ways, because there's lots of different kinds of diversity to, sort of open your mind to, but it doesn't help a whole lot, especially with the goals of anarchism, which I've been really happy to embrace for 40 plus years now, to, that's like one of the foundations I realize as I'm talking to you of the thinking. And one of the things that made sex positivity mean so much to me initially, we've got to be able to shake the top down power structures of our cultures and not recapitulate them right away in our new space, right? We've got to take that critique which is a real and vital critique, and say, okay, how else does this shine light? And to me, it shines light on the sex and gender spectra brilliantly.
Totally. Absolutely. Because there's so much power tied up in that. So much, right? And I think that's why I really enjoy this space as where we can have these conversations, and where I've seen like therapists start to follow the podcast and stuff. And like maybe this is a space where we can like have more expansion, more learning about the ways that people can show up for pleasure and whatever that means to that person, and honoring, right? Like the consensual nature of that, and the amount of space that you can play when you're in that consensual framework is huge. It is huge. Like anything like beyond a vanilla script gets really pathologized, but like my God, beyond vanilla is like every color of the rainbow, and like deep meaning, and like life force creation. I mean, like it's huge. So it's just wild to me. There's so much there.
And speaking of people using the term sex positive in a
Yeah.
pejorative way or in a manipulative way, you said vanilla and beyond vanilla, and I just want to remind all the people that vanilla wasn't intended to be a pejorative term either.
I like
I know
vanilla.
you're not using it
I
that
like
way.
it. Yeah.
And vanilla is a delicious
Yum.
flavor. You could put
Yes.
sprinkles on it or eat it by itself.
Totally.
And there are plenty of people having beyond vanilla connections that don't have, you know, the heart compassion, the ICU, fellow honored human, in whatever way that looks like, including, you know, being tied up and strung from the ceiling, or, you know, pretending to do dastardly things, or any or actually doing dastardly things, or anything. Instead, I think it's really, really important, especially for those folks who are like, well, here's how I'm gonna draw my line in the sand, that I have come out into the kink community, is by having that little sneer in my voice every time I say the word vanilla.
Yeah.
That, you know, glorious vanilla sex is glorious in some of the same ways that every other kind of erotic experience is glorious. And it doesn't matter in terms of who is around us, and even who we can trust, that they don't do the same exact things that we do. I appreciate that like seeks like, and like trust like, and all of that.
Sure.
Fine. I think that's natural. I think that's fine. But we're living in a historical moment when people are making enemies of each other way too fast, and not always for mindful, real reasons. Let's try not to do that when we don't have to.
Totally. And maybe a better word then is like anything beyond the scripts, right, of sexuality, beyond the scripts of, you know, but then I start to use more labels like heteronormativity and penis and vagina, like those scripts, like, how do we find language that doesn't other people in that conversation, but also acknowledges that like many people are living in a very like small idea of what sex is.
You know, I think that one of the things that sex positivity can help us kind of think about, although all of queer theory and all of the stuff that you're talking about also, I mean, has its role to play. It's like, if it's true that this vast spectrum from nope, no sex, never, 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 or never again, to all the sex, all of it, you know, which that's a thing too.
I love it.
Right? Who's got the time? I ask you, but I lived the 90s a little bit like that.
Yes.
So I know it. I know that feel.
Yeah.
But there's something about how any one of us at any one of these spaces in the sexual spectra can be there because we think we have to be there. You know, to get the love we want, because we never have had any alternatives introduced to us that we can understand and think and feel our way into, find desire for. You know, those of us who have to keep that stuff secret, those of us who, you know, hate ourselves because somebody taught us how to do that when we feel or experience something outside those boundaries that you're talking about. I mean, those are situations that can't heal in this sort of pop culture sense unless someone, you know, it's like AA or something. It's like when somebody's ready to say, all right, I want this support now, then That's what matters. If I want to heal, if I don't want to hurt anymore, if I want desire to be comfortable and easier, if I want to be able to find the people that I'm supposed to be having sex with because they want to do the same stuff as me rather than all the other people that I've been running into so far. There are lots of things that pop culture sex positivity can really embrace people with. So even if that was all we were talking about together today, I would call it a really important sort of healing tool or notion. And many people, of course, probably you yourself have experienced it that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the deep part, and we've already sort of inadvertently started to talk about that too, because the deep part includes the whole society and what we get from it in terms of messages, in terms of resources. Like a therapist who believes that what you do is a problem when you're doing it consensually and mindfully, and you even looked up the how to do it safely guidelines on the internet, that therapist is sadly, as well-meaning as they are, as well-trained as they feel that they were, part of the problem. The doctor who you walk in and they, try to call the cops because you've got bruises on you, even though you're trying to explain to them that was fun to get us bruises. We didn't hit anywhere dangerous, doctor. It's cool.
Yeah.
Because all of the people who have this provision of service and information to the populace role now, all of those people have become part of the mechanism to either support people in feeling good about themselves and getting what they need in terms of information, in terms of the services of the culture, or they're part of the problem.
Yep.
And are imposing sex negative notions on people, whether they realize they're doing that or not. So I hope that people in these roles will think seriously about this, because this is part of what needs to happen for deep sex positivity to actually move the needle.
Totally.
And then also, what does the law say? What's illegal? What's considered problematic and likely to get your kids taken away, even if it's not illegal per se? What are the things that the state can do, having to do in some way with your sex and gender, your behaviors, we're looking at a wavy freaking mirror right now around those issues, aren't we? We're in a terrifying and really fascinating time, because it appears that sex and gender diversity is such a powerful set of notions that it can make about a third of the populace really feel unhinged about a bunch of issues that the rest of us need for our safety and our well-being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just in case anybody thought that this was a fun episode where we were just going to talk about sex and squeal and tell stories, it's always valuable to do, but we got to remember that we're living in a serious time.
Totally. And I think that's the anarchy piece of it, right? Is like, you can talk about sex all you want, but if you don't take that larger critique of power, which is that like, hey, like I can't marry, which, is a legal thing in America where I'm going to get specific benefits from my multiple partners.
Right.
It's not just that. We have to look at the larger structure that is causing all of this, and it's all interconnected. And at the core of it is my pleasure and your pleasure and all of our pleasure, right? So like sex conversations need to, in my opinion, have this larger critique and larger conversations.
Absolutely. Because if you don't do that, if you focus on pleasure, and I am not going to gainsay focusing on pleasure, it's a fine thing to do. But if in your way of talking about the set of issues, you focus on pleasure and you focus on, sex play and sex ways and this and that, then the people around who are having challenges and difficulty around sexual issues, or even are simply happy asexuals who are like, oh, geez, you again, talking all the sex.
Yeah.
Are we gonna do I really have to hear about your weekend again?
Right.
You're a good friend of mine, but geez, whatever. The
Yeah.
person who isn't, joined up with the sex cadre, or who is in their mind but can't find people who want to have sex with them, it's just not simple. It's never as simple as we think. And getting that and going, okay, well, then how do we make space where we can talk about all this pleasure inclusive and pleasure-based stuff, and always remember to be inclusive of the people in the room for who that's not the way they're living right now. It might be the way they're living in a year.
Right.
It might be that they were living that way a couple of years ago, but they had to take a break for whatever reason. We don't, it's hard to see into other people's process and lives, and it's not really a good idea for us to inadvertently insult one another when we're trying to do our best life work. We want to try to think about making the embrace bigger. So those things are packed into deep sex positivity too, but especially the question of how we understand that we are in a world of diversity. Accept it, love it, never talk about it out loud, but understand it. I mean, there was a time when we would not have had the kind of rising up of parents of trans children that we're seeing right now, because a queer or a trans kid's own identity would have been so much a challenge to the identity of the parent that there wouldn't have been any critical mass at all for the ones who were supportive. I had wild conversations with my parents, as I bet you have too, if you talk to them,
Certainly.
about this kind of stuff before PFLAG, before parents and friends of lesbians and gays and everybody else,
Right.
who began to make that critical mass space. And I think if we wanted to write the history of why we have such passionate, positive parents of trans and queer kids right now, the fact that PFLAG 40 years ago or whenever it was, made more than 40 years ago, 45, made space for parents to have a role in this movement, whether they were queer or not.
Right.
That's really the thing. We need to make space for people to have positive roles in this whole movement, this whole series of ways to be in your relational life, in your sex life, in your gender identity, and all of it.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what's really most important, because when we exclude, they show up shitposting pretty soon, and then they vote, and then some of them get guns. It's just not good.
Right.
I don't want to, that's not it's more complicated than that, but that's the through line, I think. I see it.
Yeah. And at least I've seen, even in our community, the ways that we'll attack one another and like really get vicious with one another and not hold space for reality, that like a lot of these things require, dare I say, the privilege of the space to think about them and learn about them and all of that sort of stuff. And we don't need to be attacking other people who maybe don't have that. I mean, obviously calling people into deeper community to learn and to grow and to evolve and be held accountable for their actions is super important, but like it's not to other people, right? Like there's some deeper way to do this in community, and that's going to move all of us forward. And so I'm usually trying to talk about like, what is pleasure, more space for pleasure. Oh, I see Kat. I love Kat. But like, pleasure and authentic expression, whatever that means to the person, in a way that is not causing harm towards other people. Like, we need more of that space.
We really do. And we need, I really feel like we need compassion, because almost nobody got good sex education in this culture, right? There are some people who are likely to get more information younger than other people. That doesn't mean that they get to make the rules either, but it definitely makes a difference to call out all of our failure to have been served by the guardians of the culture and the state, because guardians of culture are parents in the church, at least, the community in which you come up,
Mm-hmm.
and they're held in a kind of esteem along with true guardians of the state, like teachers and political figures who
Psychologist.
make or repeal our laws, and doctor psychologists, other people who come in and consult when it's time to determine if there's a problem, if someone's not normal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If somebody's kids are going to get taken away. And we want those people to have had good sex education. And sadly, they haven't always had it. And even in college, especially not in Florida right now. And it's really worth everybody's time, especially if they find that there's any kind of issue that these kinds of guardians are going to participate in that will affect our well-being, to really think about why it's important to have sex education, to think about why it's important to have contraception and abortion care, why it's important to have laws that protect people who are more vulnerable, maybe give them some space to not be targeted by other people, because times are intense now. But they were intense when I was helping to found one of the first gay youth groups in the country.
I'm sure.
And they've been pretty intense the whole freaking time, especially depending on where you grew up and how you grew up, as you know. And I think all this stuff is all connected. So truly being able to talk about deep sex positivity on a podcast that takes anarchism seriously is such a gift, because I do feel like they have some interesting common roots. They're not the same thing, but they talk to each other pretty well, I think.
Yeah. I would love to hear how you see that, because I see that, and maybe the listener sees that, but I'd love to hear more about how you see that connection.
Well, partly to me, anarchism is an analysis of these power structures, and not just an analysis of power structure to help us think about how we can step up in those hierarchies, although for many people that is a study, right? And it's an important one in many ways. I mean, I want there to be queer doctors and therapists and senators. And as long as we've got an irritating Supreme Court on the Supreme Court, I want racial diversity in those places. I want many kinds of diversity in those places. And to me, that's part, if you accept the state as an entity at all, I think that those are ways to enhance how we all can get more of the wheels of power to turn in the direction that we need them to. Like right now, the actors, the screenwriters, George and Jean the cats, all their fans, everybody is every once in a while having reason to say relatively nice things about the National Labor Relations Board. And I'm sure there are anarchists who are like, screw the National Labor Relations Board, but better when it's helping you do the work you need to do to get more, rights in the workplace. It's better than when they're not supporting you in that. So to me, you got to understand these levels of power, these wheels of power, and where we come from in them, how they affect us, how we're one up in some ways and have privilege, and how we're one down in other ways and have, enemies in the state, and then in these levels of power. And then when we step away from participating in all of that to the degree that we can, how do we not recapitulate it? And also, how, even if it is our goal to step away as thoroughly as possible, what are the things that we really need to keep an eye on
Mm.
I know when I was in college in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was graffiti near campus that said, "Don't vote. It only encourages them."
Mm.
And I'm all, well, yeah, it clearly pretty much does encourage them. But the last several years, we've kind of gotten a lot of insight about what happens when too many of us turn away from that process. Like, can we turn away safely and take the vulnerable with us? Well, it turns out that we freaking can't, can we? Not yet, not right
Right.
now. So, to me, at this time in my life, as an anarchist, not voting in a mindful way prevents us from exercising care to more vulnerable populations.
Right.
And maybe we can work it out as we go, as we move through our political and human process, so that I would no longer say that. But right now
Mhm.
in this decade, I'm saying it.
Yeah, got to work within and against the systems, right? Like
Exactly.
within and against at the same time.
Because within is a really important place to see our values get reflected. I think that there are a lot of people who, especially when we're talking about pleasure and things like that, who don't see that as a collective good, right?
Yeah.
But I think that pleasure, if it's not a collective good, if we can't understand that there are still many ways, that much more path to tread to get to the space where people can access the pleasure that's right for them in a way that's safe, in a way that, where they can find joy, where they can find safety, all the wonderful things that, that being held either in community or in one person's arms can feel like for us.
Yeah.
There's no, there's no other way to embrace those things for some of us than in those contexts. If we don't care about whether other people have access to the kinds of pleasure spaces that we've been fortunate enough to build for ourselves or discover with others, then there's a streak of selfishness in that space, right?
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
not going to suggest that we should turn away from our own pleasure space in order to wait on that. That was kind of one of the core arguments between sex positive feminism and like sex neutral or really sex cranky feminism. And I don't actually mean to dishonor feminists who are like, sex can't come first until we get rid of the violence. I mean,
Mm.
I understand why people would feel that way. Honestly, I do. It's not
Yeah.
wrong, but it's also not right,
Sure.
because telling everybody that pleasure is for later, feeling good in yourself and feeling okay about yourself is for later, is not a revolutionary perspective.
No, or that
It's just not.
right, or that it was for when you were young and that stage of your life is over. That's a real fun
Oh,
narrative.
yeah, that's nonsense. Did I mention I turned 66 a couple of days ago? Stop it, people.
I love
Be
that.
like, here's what I want to say to them. If you don't feel like you want to explore and have sex, if since your second kid, you just don't have the energy, if whatever it is, if you're not in that place anymore, that's fine. Our sexualities and our identities too can be fluid across the lifespan. I'm a lot more asexual now than I was in the 90s. I want to tell you what,
Sure.
but you cannot tell another person how to live in their body, how to live in their mind, how to express themselves around those things. We can put up the fence about consent, because without that boundary, people get harmed.
Mm,
We can think about other ways that people get harmed too, because that's not
sure.
the only way that it might happen, but that's important. And acknowledging all of that stuff is not the same as saying, well, you people are just having too much fun and you don't care about the collective. or you don't care about the sisterhood, or you don't care about who and whatever,
Yeah.
the earth, we can use pleasure as a fuel.
Yeah.
And the lack of pleasure can be a true impairment for those of us who need access. And I'm not just talking about orgasms. I'm not just talking about fucking. I'm talking about feeling safe and okay in your skin and your blood. It was a wonderful title of an anarchist book, Go the Way Your Blood Beats. Right?
I love that.
We cannot cut people off from their needs for that and still be in integrity with the things that we say we want as progressives or anarchists or queers or, expansive post-vanilla people, any of it. We just can't. That's deep sex positivity.
Yeah. And I talk about the damn pleasure revolution and the power that could come if more people were experiencing pleasure and all of the different ways that you talked about, right? Feeling good in your body, feeling good in the identities, feeling good in your journey of your evolution of relationships, sensuality, sexuality, your connection to the earth. Like we can get into all of that, but I think like all of that would quite literally like fuel a revolution of change.
Which means that if anybody's listening and they're like, I don't really think the sex and gender stuff is all that important. It's like, please open your heart to what it means for somebody to feel like their identity is crushed by the state. I mean, plenty of working class people feel like that when they go to work.
Yeah.
Imagine feeling it 24/7 all the time.
Yeah.
It's not okay to tell other people what they need, right?
Right. Simple right
It's a lot
there.
better to listen to what they tell you they need.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can start to, sit in a circle and make some plans.
Totally, totally. And I think, yeah, for me as a queer, kinky, non-monogamous psychologist in training, right? I feel like I'm navigating such like that fine line as a woman in the space between the Madonna and the whore. And man, Carol, if I can do anything, I hope to navigate the direct center of both of those things of like, hell yeah, I'm divine and spiritual and good and deeply slutty and deeply into all of the quote unquote dark, whatever we want to put in that category. But like, oh man, do I want to ride that line between both and take that somewhere.
And we have been here all this time.
Rah.
Just that it hasn't been as common at all.
Yeah.
To see us in the mainstream, to speak up in these power inflected spaces, like in your program, in your classes, in standing up in court. Just imagine how many people didn't get what they needed in the world before we started to find lawyers who would be like, yeah, we'll go to the Supreme Court and argue for you. It's we've seen some rather extraordinary change over my lifespan, and I think it's in some ways not surprising that there is pushback right now.
Right.
But I don't think many of us understand quite what I'll just use scientific language, shit show it will be if more and more of those successes happen. Because how do you stuff change back into, a sack and tighten the cords and throw it in the river? You don't.
Yeah.
You kick up more, cultural dust, and that's where we're living now. And I don't want people to breathe the dust in, but when it settles on your skin, you know why it's there.
Yeah.
And let's take that on. It's so important. I'm so glad that you're talking about these issues. I'm really just very honored to have a chance to come and rant about these things with you. It means a lot to me.
It's very nicely timed because I just had a meeting about like applying to internship where I have to answer this essay of tell us about yourself, right? And it's like, my God, how honest can I be in this space about what I'm actually passionate about without getting called unprofessional because you like it makes me a little jealous. I feel like should have went down your path of like going down a Ph.D. in sexology and going down that path. Where now in the clinical psychology space, it's so like You know what I mean? So like it's nicely timed to hear you say that, because I quite literally just came from a space where like I feel in my body how much so I'm like a little bit afraid of if I'll be accepted in those spaces, which is really
Yeah,
sad.
that is really sad. And it's a strategic decision
Yeah,
to think through what you, I mean,
right.
even when your identities are fully political for you, we've still got to think about how they land. We still have to think
Right.
about how safe we are in
Yep.
various spaces. There's a lot of contingencies. It's kind of too bad that there are as many as there are, but there they are. And we do better work when we take them on and think them through, right?
Yes.
So, at the very least, whatever you put out to them is not going to be anodyne and boring and have none of your own personality in it. So you can think in terms of when privacy is necessary and strategic, or you can give them the opportunity to listen to the way you represent and yourself and argue your truth and say why it's crucial to the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
See if they
Mm-hmm.
step up.
Hell yeah. Let's see what they do. My podcast is on my CV, so they will see. And maybe Carol will be right when this episode is coming out. They'll get my application, come in and hear our conversation and dive in, baby.
Well, in that case, it was meant to be.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, I appreciate that so much so. I want to hold a little bit of space too as we come towards the end of our time, in case there is maybe something we didn't talk about that you want to share with the listeners. Otherwise, I have a closing question I can kind of guide us towards.
I just want to say that one of the things that I really want to remind people, and it's, if anything, it's even more important in this moment of AI making up its own facts. It's not bad enough that our freaking country people are also making up their own damn facts.
Right.
Now it's the machine.
Yes.
I just want to remind people that when you're looking for information on the internet, you're not getting good information that goes way back, particularly when we're talking about alternate spaces and identities.
Mm,
All of that stuff was more hidden and more secret than it is now, and it may or may not have found its way to an archive, been digitized, and show up on a search. Don't think these sex positive political changes, marriage equality, this and that, don't think they started in about 2010. Did you ever notice how if you look stuff up on the internet, a lot of stuff starts to happen around the year 2000? It's
mm,
because it didn't show up on the internet. That's not the only place to be aware that history might reside. History, resides in me and in every other older person. History
mhm.
resides in books, even though sometimes you have to read between the lines of them. It's just, I want people to be alive to the fact that all of these things we've been talking about, including political change, are processual, fluid, go back decades and decades and decades, if not centuries. And if you consider yourself an activist, it's great to be alive to that stuff. It's
Mhm.
great to take into account, because in the first place, it helps you feel great about how much has changed. In the second place, it makes you realize we all got to stay tuned
Yes. Yes. And it reminds me a
and
lot of
active. Sorry.
right. And fight,
Yeah.
right? With a lot of different tools.
Yeah.
But yeah, it reminds me too of the importance of community. Like throughout all of these things, like when you're dealing with the people who don't understand and who judge and who harm you, like the ability to have that community that you come back to that knows and understands you and
Mm-hmm.
also has the lineage of wisdom that you're referring to, right? Like there's so much wisdom tied up in these communities that is not necessarily on the internet. And so getting more connected with other people is a crucial part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said you had one last.
Yes, I do. The question I ask every podcast guest is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Diversity. I wish people understood that there's not just one way to have pleasure, experience in your body, identity, that it is not all binary. It is not all either or. It is fluid and changeable. I like to say there are, 8 million-ish people, 8 million sexual orientations.
Sure.
Because we compare ourselves to what we believe to be the norm so often. And if we switch away from heteronormativity, there we are living somewhere else. And we're still often comparing ourselves to what we think the norm is in the new identity. And while solidarity and likeness of experience are wonderful things to have in your life, they're not laws that mean that we have to cut out any other desire or experience or way of identifying. And I just think it's crucial that people come to understand that. Part of the pushback right now really, really is coming from, all right, now let's just codify binary into everything, bake it in. It's like, honeys, it's already baked in. You know, some of us jumped out of the cake.
Yeah.
And if you bake it in some more, we'll do it again. There is no normal. I'm just going to boil it down to that, because the most common question that I and other sex educators and sexologists hear, and you will too as a therapist, is, am I normal?
Yes, I hear it all the time.
It's not the right question.
You passed the anarchist test, Carol.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's almost like a secret question these days. It's like, do they deconstruct normal or do they let it pass by? So I love it. I love it. And yeah, it reminds me too of like just like the need for diversity. Like when we look at ecology and how nature thrives, like we need diversity, right? Like that is quite literally how we have healthy ecosystems. And then just like the expansion of like our existential reality, you know, I always think about that as a therapist, of that, like even the word kinky, right? Like I say that and that means something to me and it means something different to you and it's going to mean something different to someone else. And so like when we talk about normal and like the range of diversity and all of that we can create with these words and these languages that we use to like label these things, it's like, man, I could ask someone what that one word means to them for days in a session and really unpack that, because like we're all creating our own narrative of meaning making with sex. So that is huge.
And so many people don't get permission to even take sex that seriously, to think in terms of creating a narrative of meaning making.
I'm here
just
for
sex.
Oh, it's
You know?
everything to me.
There is no such. I had the most wonderful. It was a wonderful conversation. That's sort of my last word on this, probably.
Sure.
I had the most wonderful conversation on the phone. I remember pacing up and down, talking long distance to my ex-girlfriend. This happened 35 years ago now, when I was entering my program at the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, which sadly no longer exists, everybody. You can't just enroll in it now. You have to find other sexology schools. But anyway, quirkiest school in the world. He said to me, I could see it if sex was your business. I could see it if it was your hobby. But for you, it's everything. And I was all, well, in the first place, you're the person who taught me about multiple orgasms. Come on. Let's just give yourself some credit about how wise you are in the sexual realm. And then it's not one thing. It's not just one thing. Like I've used the metaphor of a faceted jewel, you know, and not everybody even sees the other side of the facets. You should turn it around and around and around. But it's okay not to be curious about what's on the other side of the jewel. It's not okay to say, there is no other side of the jewel. I can only see this side.
Right. And the reality is when you know, like sexuality and pleasure is like a center point in how I am constructing my life and what I'm choosing to build and how I want to live my life. That means I'm not going to learn a lot about fishing. And I'm going to have to one day get to my deathbed and be like, damn, I did not turn the jewel of fishing. You know what I mean? That someone else spent their whole life really focusing and studying and feeling the pleasure of that practice. And like, so
yeah, everyone gets to choose what you want to build your life around, and like the joy of the diversity.
Or stumble into it, which
Totally.
is, I mean, if you plan and navigate yourself, that's great. If you fall off the curb and find yourself in a whole new world you didn't know existed.
That was me.
Some of us got here that way too. So it's all good as long as you have the tools you need and the safe space to build what you need, right?
Absolutely.
And for some, fishing will come up at some point, and for others, not so much.
Absolutely.
It's been such a delight talking to you. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Of course. Thank you. Is there anywhere you'd want to plug so that people can find your work, your writings, the projects you're up to?
Well, people can find me at Good Vibrations, goodvibes.com. There's a page for me. You can email me through it if you want to. There's another page where people ask sex questions of my lovely colleagues and I. You can also find my book, Exhibitionism for the Shy, there, since I mentioned it earlier, and a book that I wrote for Good Vibrations, the Sex and Pleasure book, Good Vibrations Guide to Great Sex for Everyone, which I didn't name because I would never say for everyone. I don't even know, but
Sure,
fine. Let's hope that it is. And it's a compendium of lots of different information about sex, toys, porn, but also sex positivity and sex in the lifespan, fluidity, and a lot of things in the book. And you can also track down sometimes in other places, other stuff that I've written, but bunches of it are out of print now, and hence they are enriching used bookstores, which on the one hand, yay, bookstores, and on the other hand, I don't want people to have to pay that much for my books. Maybe someday I'll try to bring them back into print.
Yes, please.
But those places, and here, and every once in a while at a university or a conference near you. So not traveling as much as I used to, but I pop up.
Yes. Well, thank you for creating this conversation with me and sharing your expertise with all of the listeners today.
My pleasure and honor. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.